Hi, and welcome to Tom's Hit Parade. Now, before I go any further, I have to share this with you. This is the site that greeted me when I stopped the other day at one of my favorite local record stores, Skip's Records and CD World in Eugene, Oregon. Now, Skip said he didn't put this up to commemorate Pride Month necessarily or anything like that. He's just said he was, sick of the divisiveness that's been going on in our society for, well, years now, and but regardless of his motivation, it put the biggest smile on my face when I saw it, and I had to thank him for that. And honestly, Skip is just a genuine guy. I mean, he means every one of those words. Obviously, they wouldn't be up on his marquee if he didn't believe them. So anybody's welcome in his store as long as they're not an asshole. Yeah, if you find yourself anywhere near Eugene, Oregon, stop in at Skip's, especially if you still buy physical music media, that is. It's just a great store, the biggest independent store, I believe, between Portland and San Francisco. So there you go, reason enough to stop there, right? But anyway, on to the topic at hand. Yes, this is my commemoration of Pride Month. Yes, it's a day early, but ignore that. Now, I debated for a couple weeks whether or not to do any sort of recognition of Pride Month on my channel. And basically what made me turn the corner was a cinematic experience that I had a couple weeks ago. At least I think you can still technically call it a cinematic experience if it was actually on my Blu-ray player at home rather than in the movie theater. And the movie I'm talking about is Love, Simon. And I mean, it's the first movie in a long time that brought me to tears. I mean, it actually literally made me cry. And I could go on about this movie for an hour, but suffice it to say, if I'd had a movie like that when I was a teenager, I can only imagine how different my life would be right now. I mean, the affirmation that Simon got, not just from the characters in the movie, his schoolmates that were at the foot of the Ferris wheel, cheering him on, but from the stories that I've heard about movie theaters across the country filled with young people that were laughing and crying with him and, cheering on this queer kid looking for love. I mean, honestly, just that alone brought tears to my eyes. I mean, I could never dream of that happening when I was a teenager back in the 80s. But anyway, suffice to say, I absolutely positively loved the movie. I've already seen it a second time, and it made me cry a second time. But there was only one thing I did not care much for about the movie, and that was the music. And by that I mean, in the first 15 minutes of the movie, we got the Oogum Boogum song, which I absolutely love. I've loved it since I heard it in Almost Famous. We got that, and then we got Waterloo Sunset by the Kinks. So I was thinking, okay, this is a kid that has great taste in old classic rock and pop music. And then it's like almost the entire rest of the movie we heard just new music. And I mean, don't get me wrong, because I mean, the soundtrack is absolutely amazing. And I love Jack Antonoff's stuff so much that it actually made me go out and buy Bleacher's first album, which these two albums actually share two songs in common, in case you didn't know. But yet, I love Jack Antonoff's stuff, but honestly, I would have loved to have heard, I felt a little bit cheated with the movie being front-loaded with, a handful of old classic songs. And then to get nothing but more contemporary stuff. As I said, not that it's not good. I love Jack Antonoff's contributions to this soundtrack. And then Troye Sivan. I mean, I absolutely love Troy's voice. I mean, it's just, he's got a new album coming out later this year, which I will probably expound upon till the sun goes down. But anyway. And Amy Shark's song, Sink In, I'm really curious to hear more of her stuff. She's coming out with an album, I believe, later this month, so I'm really curious to hear that. And one of the very next CDs I'm going to go out and buy is the 1975's I Like It When You Sleep, because the song Love Me, which is on the soundtrack, is off that album. And I had listened to a little bit of their stuff back in the day, and for some reason didn't connect with it. But this soundtrack changed all that. But yeah, it is an awesome album, fantastic soundtrack. I love it just as much as I love the movie. And will a soundtrack album be my favorite album of the year 2 years in a row? It's a distinct possibility with this. But anyway, yeah, Love, Simon just it kind of made my year. I mean, another thing that movie did was it kind of gave me hope for the young generations for the first time in quite a while, since a certain someone shoehorned his way into the White House. But anyway, so yeah, this episode's going to be a little bit of a salute to Pride Month. One of the things, another thing I got just recently was I believe the first annual Pride issue of Billboard magazine. I don't subscribe to Billboard, but I follow them on Facebook, and I saw that they were putting this issue out. And again, Troy on the cover. So yeah, I had to pick it up. Strangely, the cover date is June 16th, but it actually didn't show up at our local Barnes & Noble until this past week. So be that as it may. It's a good issue. I haven't exhaustively read it through yet. I've only glanced at it so far, but I'm very much looking forward to reading the rest of it. So yeah, I thought I would go through a little bit of sort of the queer history of music, just a little bit here and there, touchstones, at least the music in my collection. Now, we already know about the Melissa Etheridges and the Elton Johns and the Katie Langs, and a lot of you probably are familiar with Rufus Wainwright. So, but this is going to cover some of the lesser-known LGBTQ artists. I'm going to start off with another soundtrack. Now, this was a British movie, Get Real, which was made in 1999. So, it's another high school coming out movie, kind of like Love, Simon, but of course very different since it was made almost 20 years ago. But the soundtrack is fantastic. It's got mostly lesser-known British artists, but it's got Word Up, the classic disco song by Cameo, as well as Love Is All Around by the Trogs. I love that song. And it's got a couple of cool covers too, covers of Play That Funky Music, White Boy, and You Are So Beautiful, the Joe Cocker song. But this has also got one of my favorite songs of all time. It's by an obscure British band called the Milk and Honey Band, and it's a song called Beautiful One. And as far as I know, I have a compilation of Milk and Honey Band, and that song is not on there, and I don't think it's on any of their studio albums either. So, and I cannot find it on YouTube, so I'm kind of thinking of possibly uploading it onto YouTube. Hopefully the copyright bots won't get me if I do that. But anyway, yeah, Get Real. It's a good movie. It's full of that quirky British humor, so check it out if you haven't yet. If you're a fan of, coming out movies in general, don't miss it. And then I've got a soundtrack compilation. This was put out by Varese Sarabande Records. It's a soundtrack, or it's a label specializing in soundtracks. Been around for 35, 40 years. And this is instrumental re-recordings, not original soundtrack pieces, of LGBTQ movies from, well, this was also made in 1999, so from the previous 15 or so years. Beautiful Thing, which is yet another fantastic, one of my top 5 favorite LGBT movies. Go see that if you haven't yet. Billy's Hollywood Screen Kiss, that was, I believe, Sean Hayes from Will and Grace. That was his first feature film role. Jeffrey, that was another good movie. And there's also an instrumental rendition of The Streets of Philadelphia, Bruce Springsteen's song from the movie Philadelphia. So yeah, this is a very cool compilation here. I picked it up as soon as I saw it back in 1999, and it's been in my collection ever since. And then we have just a regular compilation, not a soundtrack compilation or something attached to a movie, but this is just a compilation called Love Rocks. It benefited the Human Rights Campaign, and it's a 2-disc set, and the lineup on here: Christina Aguilera, Dixie Chicks, Dido, Carole King, Mandy Moore, Melissa Etheridge, the B-52s, Cyndi Lauper. I mean, you gotta go get it. I mean, it's absolutely packed with songs. And obviously, if you're buying it secondhand, it's not going to directly benefit Human Rights Campaign, but it's a must-have in my collection anyway. And then some individual LGBTQ artists of various sorts I thought I'd show you. Now, just because I can't think of a better analogy, if there's such a thing as the Sgt. Pepper's of LGBTQ albums, it would be The Age of Consent by Bronski Beat. Now, this came out, I mean, before I ever, came out to myself. But this was put out in 83 or 84, I believe. And this was, of course, back before the internet, when queer imagery, like the ever-popular pink triangle, was little known to people who were not educated in such matters. I mean, you couldn't just look up the meaning of pink triangle on the internet. So yeah, it had a lot of hidden messages and stuff that queer kids, especially closeted queer kids, could pick up on. So if you were in the closet and you had this album, your parents saw it, they'd probably be none the wiser. So this was just kind of one of the touchstone albums of LGBTQ music. And then we have probably the first popular transgender musician. You all know of Anoni, at least I think I'm pronouncing that name properly, formerly Antony of Antony and the Johnsons. She was not the first trans musician. That honor goes to Wendy Carlos. She was born Walter Carlos and underwent gender reassignment, or began gender reassignment in 1968, which was actually the date of this album, her debut album, Switched on Bach. But she didn't actually come out as transgender until 1979. So, but yeah, this is a great album. It won a few Grammys, I believe, and was a very popular, very high-selling album. And I've actually, my musical tastes have intersected with Wendy Carlos a few times over the years. She later on went into film scoring. She scored Kubrick films like A Clockwork Orange and The Shining, and also Disney's original movie Tron. Excellent score, one of the pioneering electronic synth-driven scores. And also, as you may have seen in my Weird Al Week postings last month, she collaborated with Al on a rendition of Peter and the Wolf by Prokofiev. She did the instrumental synthesizer electronic-driven adaptation of Prokofiev's music. And then we move on to one of the most recent examples of transgender individuals in music today, and that is Teddy Geiger. Obviously, this is pre-transition. This album was from 2006, and it's got great songs. He had a great voice and just a great sound. The singer-songwriter, guitar-based stuff, and obviously a great songwriter because she has written for. She's much more popular now as a songwriter than as an artist, and has written for. Most notably Shawn Mendes in, I believe, all three of his albums, or at least his two most recent ones. But, hey, I mean, just looking at the cover, I mean, jeans and t-shirt kind of guy, handsome. So, that was one reason I got into him, but also, the songs were great. But when I heard that she was transitioning, my heart just went out to her. I mean, you have to wonder, the major labels, especially with the teenage and young adult artists, and especially back in the late 90s, early 2000s, they definitely very much groomed the image and sound of an artist to appeal to the demographic. So I have to wonder how much of this was real and how much of it was, just a put on, and, was she suffering from this gender dysphoria even back then? So, listening to it now, it kind of takes on a different feel. So I would be interested to know if Teddy was feeling that stuff back then, or if he was unaware of the person that his heart would eventually lead him to be. So, and yes, I know I've been kind of playing fast and loose with the pronouns. That's kind of how my mind thinks is, when I'm talking about Teddy Geiger now, she is the pronoun I use, but when I'm talking about Teddy Geiger then, he is what sticks in my mind. So, the dynamic pronouns, I guess, is... Anyway, I'm trying and failing to explain myself. So anyway, another noteworthy LGBTQ artist of the past is Stephen Gately. And he is notable because he was the first singer in an active boy band at the time to come out publicly. And he did so. I mean, Boyzone was basically at the end of their run, at least until they reformed back in, 2009, I think it was. But I have always been jealous that Ronan Keating had the more successful solo career. I mean, this was Stephen's one and only solo album, but his voice, I mean, I just absolutely loved he had just this honey sweet voice, just beautiful songs. Perhaps Ronan Keating's songs were a little better, but honestly, I have such a soft spot for Stephen Gately. And there are a few other LGBTQ artists in my library I thought I would share with you briefly that I really enjoy. Faraz is one of them. And this is the only album that I think he put out, at least on a physical format anyway. Aliens and Rainbows, and it's just great. It's just great pop music. Honestly, I don't know how else to describe it. It's got a lot of varied sounds in here. You might be familiar with the song "Hollywood's Not America." It was used, I think, most prominently as the exit song on a season of American Idol. But honestly, if that's the only song of his that you've heard, explore him more, because in my opinion that was the most boring song on this album. Something About You is the best dance song that you've never heard. Look it up. Everybody Bleeds the Same, that's another great one. A downbeat song that I really enjoyed was My Beautiful Life, and what makes that one different is that he speaks the lyrics rather than sings them. So it's just got a very moody, atmospheric feel. And Dear God, if you want to know my feelings about organized religion, the song Dear God basically sums that up for you. But yeah, I mean, there's pretty much not a bad song on this album. Anyway, For Us, Aliens and Rainbows, you should check that one out. And then one of the more unusual ones in my library is A Classical Organist. Yeah, not exactly mainstream, right? Cameron Carpenter, and he does a little avant-garde kind of thing. It's not your granddaddy's classical organ, I guess you'd say. For one thing, he writes his own compositions and puts them on his albums. So aside from Bach and Rachmaninoff and Chopin and whatever, he puts his own stuff on the albums, and it's a very unusual sound. It's like I said, you think you've heard organ until you hear this guy. He's very interesting, and very interesting to listen to. He's Amoeba Music, which is a chain of 3 stores that throughout California. They have a series on their YouTube channel called What's in My Bag, and I listened to the episode featuring him, and he is actually very knowledgeable about music, and just very interesting to listen to. So I kind of respect him in that regard also. And then we have somebody you might be familiar with from her appearances on Orange is the New Black, amongst other movie and TV roles, Leah Delaria. And she has done a few albums. Her most recent one, at least on physical format, on CD and LP, I think it's on LP anyway, was a David Bowie tribute. But this one actually covers all sorts of different artists, from Bruce Springsteen, No Doubt, Soundgarden, The Doors, Green Day. I mean, she does it all on this album, and they're very interesting renditions too, kind of modern jazz renditions of popular rock and pop songs. So Double Standards by Leah Delaria is highly recommended. And then we have another one of the slightly more unusual singer-songwriter types, Jay Brannon. I've got 3 of his albums, and what's really interesting about him is that it's a study in contrasts with this guy. I mean, you look at him and he's this, kind of slightly bad boy, ruggedly handsome sort of guy, but he has such a beautiful, angelic, delicate voice. And it's just not what you'd expect by looking at him. And he couches that voice in songs that have kind of sardonic and dark lyrics. Not quite all of the songs. I mean, some of the songs are more lighthearted, but yeah, that's his thing, is kind of, juxtaposing kind of dark lyrics with that beautiful, beautiful voice of his. So I recommend this guy, Jay Brannon. Check him out. And this next one you've actually heard me mention. Was in both of my year-end countdowns that I've had on this channel, my 2014 and 2017. And that is Dutch singer-songwriter, pop musician Wouter Hamel. And this is his 4th album, the one that really made me fall in love with his music. He didn't actually come out high profile. I mean, I don't think he was actually in the closet at the time of this album, but he kind of made a high profile coming out with the album after this, Amory. This is my favorite album of his, Pompadour. But yeah, Amory, the lead single off that album was Hey Now, and that is a very affirmatory, feel-good song about being who you are, and it's one of my favorite songs, and definitely one of my favorite songs of his. But yeah, Wouter Hamel. If you like Jamie Cullum, but with a smoother voice, his album Evolution, the evolution of his sound, has really followed Jamie Cullum. He started out as much more of a jazz-oriented musician, but his material has gradually morphed into more pop-sounding stuff. So Yeah, I love Wouter Hamel. He's probably one of my top 10 favorite musicians of all time. And then we have a jazz-oriented singer, Spencer Day. Now I've only got 2 of his albums, his 2 Concord releases, but he's released at least one more. I think at least 2 more actually. But yeah, if you like Michael Bublé, I guess is probably the closest comparison. This guy is great. He's got a beautiful voice, obviously fantastic voice, great arrangements. I mean, he's excellent stuff. And then there's a couple others. Most of you are probably familiar with Mika. He's a British singer-songwriter. He's put out 4 albums or 5. He's much more of a kind of a quirky, colorful, as you can kind of tell is suggested by the album cover here, pop music, very, very bouncy, feel-good stuff. And then also Sam Sparrow, who has kind of like Teddy Geiger, he's moved into more of a songwriting and production capacity lately, but I love both of his studio albums. They're just fantastic. Another, again, very pop, kind of like Faraz. So yeah, that is a brief look at some of the LGBTQ albums and artists in my collection. I admit that I did go through a bit of a phase many years ago where I kind of reflexively picked up albums by artists just because I found out they were gay, and needless to say, after a couple of dismal failures and excruciatingly boring albums, that trend came to an end. And honestly, with a lot of these artists, I didn't find out they were queer until after I'd become a fan. So that just kind of goes to show you that in a lot of ways, the music that you love will find you instead of you going out searching for it. So yeah, that's it for this video. Happy Pride Month to anybody and everybody who celebrates it. No matter who you are, let your freak flag fly. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, life's too short to be a music snob.